One, one is that you will be receiving a copy of Chris's PowerPoint, and we are recording this, and probably sometime later this week, we will have it posted on our website. And that's, I think we'll pop that website up into chat so you can write it down, so you can grab it if you need it. Let's see. We encourage you to use the Q&A and chat features if you have any questions. Tends to make it a lot more interactive when there's some back and forth going on. And let's see, lastly, you'll receive a brief survey. I think there's 4 questions on it that kind of ask, well, how good of a job we did at this. And if you have any suggestions, that'll make it better. So those are that are not aware what SCORE is. Well, let me back up. My name is Ed Cook. I am a SCORE counselor in Canton, Ohio. I retired from PepsiCo back in the end of 2012, I think. And this is one of the things that I volunteer at. So SCORE is a national nonprofit that began back in 1964. And since then, we've grown quite a bit. We have over 225 chapters, 11,000 counselors like myself. There's quite a few chapters in Ohio, actually. Those of you that aren't in Canton, there should be chapters close to you. They are in most metropolitan cities. Besides sponsoring educational workshops like this, we counsel small businesses, and that's really what we're about. We provide free and confidential counseling to people that want to start up a business or have a business that's not running the way they thought it should. And we do it for profit or for nonprofits. So you can see how to contact us. There's our email address, our website, as well as a phone number. I'm assuming that's the website you would go to if you want to obtain a copy, if you want to listen to a copy of this recording. So locally, we're funded by the Stark Community Foundation, the Hoover Foundation, Stark State University, and we're a resource partner for the with the SBA. Locally, we have about 47 counselors, and we each have a very different business background and different skill sets. So we have people that are in marketing or were in marketing and banking, supply chain, HR. So depending upon what your needs are, we kind of pull a team together that will best help you. So, and you can see our contact information there on the screen. With that, those of you that weren't here earlier, we're asking that you each mute yourself if you can, so we don't get any background dogs barking or what have you. And Gwen and I will be monitoring the questions, and Chris will be answering them as we go. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris. He'll do a brief intro of himself, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ed. Before I kind of do my intro, one of the things I want to stress is how great of an organization SCORE is. So I've been at the center for a little over 20 years now, and we've continually referred business owners, both startups, early stage, as well as at any level that need assistance in doing what they need to do to keep their business running and growing and moving forward. And so it's a tremendous resource. All of the volunteers that we've worked with have been great, fantastic. So I really encourage folks to take advantage of the resource that is SCORE, right? So really happy to be here today and to be able to provide this info for SCORE, but also to all of you here today. So as Ed said, I'll just do a real quick, brief introduction of myself. My name is Chris Cooper. I'm the director of the Ohio Employee Ownership Center. And so we're located at the main campus at Kent State University. So we're right here on the main campus, right in the middle of campus, actually. And we've been around since about 1987. And so we kind of got started as a support organization for businesses that were transitioning to some form of employee ownership. And so we're going to briefly touch on employee ownership here in a little bit, but we're not. This session is not about employee ownership. Um, uh, per se. And about 10 years after we got started, we realized that we were working with a lot of businesses that really needed help with kind of the step before they even thought about selling to one of the forms of employee ownership. They needed real basic support for planning for succession. And so what we mean when we talk about succession is moving from one generation of ownership to the next. Typically that's the companies that we work with, it's the founding generation, right? But not always. Sometimes it's the second and third generation of business owners that we work with. But uh, folks needed that kind of basic support. Okay, so what is succession planning? How do I think about it? What do I need to start doing? What are my options? And all of those kind of things. So about in the mid 90s, about 95, 96, we started the business succession planning program. And our goal there is to provide business owners with like this basic introduction and overview and kind of a way to start thinking about what's going to happen to their business as it becomes time for them to exit out of it in some way, shape, or form, right? So we started the business succession planning program. And again, it's a kind of a broad kind of, approach to succession planning. And you'll see that as we go through the presentation today, what I mean by that broad approach. And so give you a little bit of background about me. I've been here, as I mentioned earlier, about 23 years. I always have to remember I'm getting older and older every year that goes by. So I keep on having to add years to my tenure here. So I got to remember that sometimes, go back and remember that. But so I've been involved with the business succession planning program for most of those 20 plus years. In addition, I've also gone through the certified exit planning advisor role. So I have that designation from the Exit Planning Institute as well. So we've been working with hundreds of business owners as they thought about succession planning and what's going to happen to them, their families, and to their business as they realize that it's time for them to start thinking about how they're going to exit that business. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. You'll get a slide at the end with information about our center and how to reach out to us. We already went through the info for SCORE here. I really, again, I want to say I encourage all of you to get in touch with the folks at SCORE. Great folks, great people, and they're really helpful with the work what they do. And as Ed mentioned, it's a broad range of stuff, right, that they can help you with. But so let's start talking about succession planning. So when we talk about business succession planning, what we mean is transitioning from one owner or group of owners to the next group, next owner or group of owners, right? So we're talking about ownership succession. So I know there's a subset of succession planning where you kind of talk about organizational succession planning, like who's going to, as an organization ages and people retire, you need people to fill those roles and those kind of things. That's a kind of a part of business succession planning, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that here today. But what we're talking about is ownership. Somebody owns a business, who's going to own it next, right? And so I talk to a lot of business owners. I've literally talked to hundreds of business owners that are thinking about this, and they always ask me why. The typical business owner, there's typical traits of business owners and entrepreneurs. And one of the questions I always get asked is, so why do I really need to plan for this kind of thing? What's the rationale for kind of really setting aside the needed time to do this kind of planning? And what I always say is it improves the chances of business survival. For those businesses and business owners who don't plan for a transition process, right? Transition of the business. We've seen a lot of bad things happen, right? Businesses can be challenged by sudden, if you're a business owner and something happens that makes a sudden transition necessary, those are tough situations to be in. And so a thoughtful, a process of succession planning really improves the chances of business survival. And I always say, you know, my dad was a small business owner and didn't really handle that succession planning process as well as it could have been handled, right? And so the idea is uh, when that transition becomes necessary, as it did with my dad, things happen, right? And so typically a business owner doesn't necessarily want to create a business so that it goes away when they exit out of the business, right? The typical business owner, in my experience, would like to see this business go on. They've spent a lifetime building this business and growing the business and working in the business. And, you know, deep down inside, I think they would like to see it survive and move forward and grow and become something different, right? So planning for succession really improves the chances of that happening. It's prudent, right? So the typical, we're going to talk about this in a few slides down the road, but for the typical business owner, that business is the primary asset that they have, right? And you know, what happens to that and how they're going to fund their retirement and all those kind of things. It's a prudent thing to do, right? It's just like, you know, retirement planning, right? Setting up some kind of retirement plan. It's prudent, right? It makes sense. It's in the interest of all stakeholders. So typically the primary stakeholder that we work with is the business owner or owners, right? But in any small business, there's a broader group of stakeholders that we like to at least bring into the conversation. So we're talking about the business owner, we're talking about their families, we're talking about the employees, we're talking about the community, and we're talking about all of these things, right? And so I think it's in the interest of all stakeholders. We're talking about communities, right? We all know what it's like to see longtime businesses in a community suddenly go away because succession planning was not thought of or properly taken care of. And we always notice those things missing once they're gone, right? So the idea is let's talk about this before that happens, right? And it's strategic. I think we always try to encourage business owners to think of planning for succession and planning for their exit as part of their strategic process, right? Too many business owners kind of think of that as something to start thinking about when they're 60 or 65, or I've seen situations where some business owners are in their 70s or even older when they just start thinking about this. And we think it should come back, right, into a earlier process and as part of your strategic plan for the business, right? What's going to happen when you exit the business is that succession plan is a strategic planning as well. All right. And so typically what we talk about, there are four elements of a plan. So you've got the economic, right? So I mentioned the role of the economics and the amount of equity and value that a business owner has tied up in the business and how they're going to fund the things that they want to do as they enter that next stage of life, right? Then there's that next stage of life, right? It's the personal and emotional. I typically find business owners, it's a very personal thing for business owners. I know it was for my dad when he was running his business, that it was a personal thing. It was an emotional thing. I always tell the story that for the employers, I'm sorry, for the employees that worked at my dad's business, they were part of our family, right? So funerals, weddings, right? All of those kind of things were birthday parties, right? Were part of that whole kind of fabric of that business operating, right? So it's personal and emotional things. It's also from the personal and emotional side of things, it's kind of thinking about the next stages of life, right? As we get, we're all aging, right? And as we get to that point where we have to think about doing something differently, that can be you know, an issue for some folks. It's transactional. So there's mechanics. I always talk about transactional as the mechanics. What are the tools, the methods that we use to transfer an asset from one person to another person, right? So that's the mechanical part. There's some challenges there too, right? It's things you got to think about. And then there's that future planning, kind of ties into that personal and emotional, right? What's I know it was one of the biggest issues with my dad was his kind of whole essence of being, right, was tied up into this business. It was a very small business, right? It wasn't a very big business at all. but it was such an integral part of who he was that he kind of was challenged in a very real way about, okay, what does it look, what does my life look like, right? When that's no longer such a big part of it, right? So that future planning, future planning is that kind of emotional side. It's the economic side, right? Funding your retirement to do the things that you want to do. And all of those things kind of get wrapped up into that future planning. So why do I need to plan? Well, so I think, we kind of talked about a few of the whys there, right? But there's also some other things. I talk to a lot of business owners, and I think it kind of describes my dad as well, that his perspective was, I'm enjoying what I'm doing. I don't want to quit doing it. So why do I need to start thinking about succession planning? And I always tell people, kind of take them back, you will exit the business one way or the other. And too often people assume that succession planning means that I stop doing what I love to do. And I don't, it can mean that, right? But it doesn't have to mean that, right? So, but it is a fact of life, right? You are going to exit your business one way or another. It's just a question of who's going to be in kind of control of that situation. I tell business owners all the time, you can plan for a succession while still doing what you love and still working in the business if that's what you want to do. I'm the last person that's going to tell business owners that they need to stop doing what they love, to do, but you just still got to start some planning. And nowadays, when I started in this business 20 years ago, this wasn't quite as common, but nowadays, last 10 years, I see it all the time. Customers and vendors, especially customers, they want to know, if you have a big customer who's reliant on you for something very important, they're going to want to know, right? What's going to happen if you're no longer there, right? How can I guarantee that I can still get what I need from you, or do I need to start looking for someone else, right, to provide me what I need, right? So a lot of times customers or vendors want to know what your succession plan is, right? Sources of financing. So
Hey,
typically banks.
Chris,
Yes.
we have a question from Barbara.
Okay.
She's asking for any recommendations on best practices for creating one. Is there a template out there or anything like that?
Yeah.
Any
Yeah. So
suggestions?
that's a really good question. I don't know if there's a full-on template, right? Because each business is so singular, people, we like to lump people into these large groups, but I find every entrepreneur that I work with and every business that I work with is different in its own way. So one of the things we will provide you, so we put together a book a couple years ago. It's called um, uh, a business succession planning and owner's manual. Right. And so within that manual, Ed and his team are going to send that out to you. They're going to post it on the website. There's a bunch of worksheets. There's about 10 worksheets back there that help you kind of start to develop your plan. Right. And so we created those worksheets for precisely that. So I would hesitate to call them a true template in a sense. Right. But they really kind of start you thinking about, okay, how much money am I going to need to finance my retirement? How do I analyze what I'm going to need, what the business is going to need once I'm no longer a part of that business? All of those kind of things are kind of dealt with in those worksheets, but eventually there's going to be a need for you to get some professional help. So we can kind of help you develop a framework for your succession plan. But in addition, you're going to need, the proper set of advisors. You're probably going to need an attorney at some point in time. You're probably going to need a personal financial planner. You might need an appraiser to figure out how much your business is worth. And we're going to talk about these things. So through, the materials that we're going to send out, the opportunity that we're happy to talk to anyone who's on this webinar about thinking about developing their framework for their plan. And we can make referrals, all of those kind of things. We can help you develop that plan, but I find the typical business is so individual in a sense, right, that templates aren't really viable, right, because businesses are going to do a lot of different things through this process. Does that make sense, Ed?
Yes, yes, it does. Thanks,
Okay.
Chris.
Yep. And if we didn't answer what you wanted to hear, let us know. I can talk further on that, but also can talk offline as well. Happy to do that. So I was on the sources of financing. So typically banks want to know what your succession plan is, especially if you have a loan of some sort, right? So if you have a line of credit or some type of capital loan with them, they're going to want to know, okay, so what's your succession plan? Are we going to get our money back on this, right? And so they often want to know what are you planning, right? Key employees may want to know. I don't know if all employees need to know what your business is, right? But if you have key employees that are thinking to themselves, they're noticing something, I noticed that Joe here, he's getting older. I don't see a succession plan. Maybe I need to think about my future and go somewhere else, right? If those people are vitally important to your business, then I think it's understandable that they would want to know what your succession plan is. Because they want to know what their future is as well. And of course, family, right? Even if whether you have family in the business or not in the business, right? Typically, they're going to want to know what your succession plan is. I know that my dad worked until he was in his 70s, and my mom retired when she was 65. And for years, my mom was like, when are you going to retire? What's your plan? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Right. The funny thing is, once my dad did retire, my mom was like, when are you going to go out and get a hobby? Right. You're getting on my nerves a little bit here by being home all the time. Right. Because they're not used to that. But it was kind of funny. But family want to know, right? Maybe family wants to know what's going to happen with this value that's tied into the business. Are they going to get their piece out of that, right? Who's going to share in that value as well? So all of these folks are going to want to know in some way, shape, or form what your plan is. Some of the key issues in succession planning are loss or change of purpose. Talked about that a little bit. That's a real tough kind of emotional, mental hurdle to get over for a lot of business owners. Loss of control is kind of the same, right? Entrepreneurs, business owners. I know it was true with my dad. They want to be in control. My dad was constitutionally unable to work for other people, right? He liked having that control. He was a nice guy, right? He wasn't a mean kind of guy, right? But he liked having that control, and you got to let go. At some point, you're going to let go of the business. Continuity of the business, right? How can we structure this succession plan so the business stays open? And it's not just kind of a legacy thing either. Legacy can be important, but oftentimes, business owner, it's going to take you a few years to get all of your money out of the business, right? It's less typical now than it was maybe 30 years ago, where you would sell your business and you take your check and you'd be okay. Typically, the typical succession plan, it might take you a few years to get all of your money, all of your value, your equity out of the business, right? And so in order to get that, right, you're going to need the business to continue without you. There's the value of the business. For the typical business owner, 70-80% of their net worth is tied up in that business, right? So how much that is very important. And again, and we're going to kind of discuss all of these things throughout the rest of the presentation, but it's the complexity of the process, right? And so transferring a large asset can be complex. There's a lot of tax issues, legal issues, financing issues, all of those kind of things. And so it can be a complex process. And so our goal here today is to give you a framework that talks about your goals and objectives before, and then we'll bring in the proper experts to help you with the complex pieces, right? So kind of get that larger view, take a step back kind of view. But the process itself can be complex. So where do you start as a business owner? I kind of just mentioned it with the previous slide, but we always start with a business owner. What are your goals and objectives? We find developing a strong sense of your goals and objectives really helps you cut through the complexity, cut through the process, and cut through your kind of mentally and emotionally what you're going to be doing with your succession plan. So we take folks, and these questions are in those worksheets that I mentioned that are in that book, right? What do I want for the business? Where do you see the business going? What do you want for the business? What do you want or even need from the business, right? And typically that's that's money, right? But it's also kind of the next stage, right? Would you like to stay apart, even though you're kind of dialing back, right? Your role, would you like to still be involved because you love doing what you're doing, right? So want or need, money and kind of purpose, right? Tied into those. Who should own the business and who should run the business? So, the typical business entrepreneur, the business owner, thinks that those two things are exactly the same, right? The owner is the one running the business, right? And that's what my dad did. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, right? So you can kind of separate those out if you want to. Uh, but you have to do it in a certain way, right? So you can still own the business or own a part of the business, but no longer run the business. There's a number of family-owned businesses out there that are still owned by the families, but they don't actually on a day-to-day basis run the business, right? Maybe they're still on the board of directors or something along those lines. But the owner doesn't necessarily have to be the one running it either, but it can be, right? So all of those issues, these kind of four keys are what we really focus on in that first conversation with the business owner as you start to develop your plan. The next thing is how much is my business worth? So one of the things I always do on presentations is I preempt my future slides, right? So I already mentioned a couple of these things, right? It's just the way my mind works, right? But I always say one of the things you're going to need to do is get a sense of what your business is worth, right? So I'm going to say this and it'll make sense to you, but often we find that business owners tend to have an inflated value of what their business is worth, right? Because it's valuable to them, right? And they think that everybody else should share that sense of how valuable this business is, right? But the reality is, not everyone will, right? And so you really have to take a good hard look at how much that business is worth and be realistic about that, right? I've seen business owners that have significantly undervalued their business as well, right? So I've seen it both ways, but you need to know what you have before you can decide what to do with it, right? So think about it this way. If you have a car, if you have an antique and you want to sell it, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to try to figure out how much it's worth so you know how much to ask for it, right? And so it's the same thing here, right? So again, for most business owners, this is what I mentioned earlier, 80% of for 80% of business owners, that business is their single largest asset. So it's probably going to be the way they're going to finance their retirement in a very real sense. So you're going to need to know how much that is. So what you receive for the business is very important. And is it enough? I was talking to a business owner about a year and a half ago who wanted to kind of start transitioning out of the business, got the business valued, realized that wasn't the number that he was hoping for. And so made the decision that he was going to continue to work in the business for another couple of years, try to get it up to the value that he wanted and needed, right? And so that's where he's at right now. So those kind of conversations happen all the time. With a business valuation, there's a lot of different types. So there's a lot of different ranges. You can pay anywhere from 500 to $40,000 for a business valuation, right? And so a lot of that depends on the size of the business, the complexity of the business, and who's doing the valuation and the type of valuation that you're getting, right? So, a lot of business brokers are out there and they can do a basic business valuation for 500, 1,000, 1,500 bucks, right? We can do a kind of real super duper basic, not much value to it sort of valuation of the business by looking at, um, your financials, kind of getting a sense of your EBITDA and assigning some sort of multiple to that, right? The understanding is what you pay for the valuation is in a very real sense the kind of quality of the valuation, right? So but that's not saying anything bad about those real basic valuations that are, sometimes that's enough to get a broad sense of what you have. Sometimes you want to spend a little more money and get a more in-depth valuation of the business, right? And so there's different types or levels of business valuations. We're going to talk about ESOPs, one of the forms of employee ownership. They have a legal standard for what's needs to be included in an ESOP valuation, a sale to the employees through an ESOP, right? So all of these different levels of valuation will depend on your thinking, right? If you're thinking about putting your business on the market, that business broker or that M&A person, depending on the size of your business, that valuation is probably a pretty good sense, because ultimately the value, the money that you're going to get for your business is going to be based on what someone wants to pay for it, right? And so maybe that's enough for right now. Maybe in the initial stages of planning, you get a real basic valuation done. And then as you progress, maybe you need to dig in a little bit deeper when you're talking about real numbers. People always assume that the value of something is a single number, right? So what you're typically going to get with a valuation is a range, right? So we see your business being somewhere in X and Y, right? These two numbers. Somewhere in there seems like a reasonable valuation in there, but you're not going to get, typically not going to get a single number, right? So it's going to be a range rather than a single number. So basically, why you're doing this, business owners often chafe against spending that extra money to get a business valuation because they feel that they know what the value of the business is, right? But what you want to get is a kind of an independent outside view of, if you put this business on the market, how much would someone likely pay for it, right? And then you do the personal needs assessment with that valuation. Can I maintain my standard of living? Is that important for me? Is that business a primary asset for my retirement, or have I invested in other things, right, that are going to finance retirement, and anything I get out of this business is going to be icing on the cake, so to speak, right? Do you have charitable goals? Would you like to do something with this value that you've built up in the business? What retirement goals? Are you going to be like this gentleman in the slide, wanting to buy a sailboat and spending some time out on the water, or are your needs going to be a lot less? What kind of health needs do you have? Does your family, your spouse have, right? All of those kind of things are going to be built in. So that's hopefully this, when you get this range, when you get a very good sense, independent sense of what your business is worth, you can start making these decisions, right, of what's going to happen in the future. And then you identify the financial gap with that valuation. So what's the difference, right, between what I have and what I need? How have I planned financially for my exit, and how do I bridge that gap? And I mentioned that business owner earlier that thought, how I'm going to bridge this gap is going to, work for another year and a half, 2 years, try to build up this business. I know that was the feeling with my dad. One of the reasons why he stayed in the business until he was in his 70s was because he wanted to keep on trying to drive the value of that business a little bit further, right? So we talk about time frames. So people ask me, when should I start planning for succession? Again, I mentioned earlier that succession should be part of strategic planning, right? It's not just I don't want to say there's a time that's too late, right? But I talk to a lot of business owners that are contacting me when they're 62, 65. Had one business owner tell me that his timeline of exiting the business was going to be in the next 5 to 7 years. And I asked him how old he was, and he said 81, right? So he was a very optimistic person, right? That he was going to continue to work in this business for a while. But generally, the earlier you start, the more options, the more flexibility, the more opportunity you're going to have to do things, right? So earlier is always better. We always try to get in front of business owners when they're in their 50s, maybe even a little earlier, 40, late 40s, early 50s, right? Because you never know if something's going to happen, right? You just never know. And again, understand that any succession plan that you put together when you're still 10, 15 years out from the transition time, it's probably going to change, right? And that's okay. But at least you have a sense of kind of like what would happen in that emergency situation, but also kind of thinking about that kind of exit point in time can help you drive business decisions to get your business set up to go there, right? Does that make sense? And so sometimes it takes time, right? So 2 to 3 years, you can make some modest changes, accounting processes and staffing. One of the things that we see with a lot of small businesses is that their processes and procedures haven't kept up with growth, right? So if you've got a business that started out with 3 people and now it's got 15 or 20 or 25, 30 people or whatever, sometimes the processes haven't kept up with that, right? And so what that means is you're going to have to change those, right? That takes time and expense and attention to do that. But also it's your opportunity to do big changes is limited in that time frame, right? And so, but a buyer, if you're positioning your business to sell to an outside buyer, they're going to want to know that when they come in, are they going to have to do a lot of like backfilling on this kind of stuff, right? And if so, they're going to tick some dollars, right? They're going to start ticking down some dollars on that sale price, right? 3 to 7 years, you can expand and leave markets, new products, geographies, right? So again, the longer time you have, the greater opportunity you also have to make fundamental changes to the business to help grow the business and make that endpoint all that more successful for you, right? So more time, more change is possible. So you need to assess your company's state of operations, right? Management and leadership. Often that business owner is is key, is key to the day-to-day operations of that business. And what happens if that person is no longer there, right? Well, is the business still going to run smoothly, run well, right? Keep things moving, keep your customers happy, keep your suppliers happy, all of those kind of things, right? So you got to think about your management and leadership. And so again, in that book that I mentioned that Ed's going to send out, it has a worksheet on these kind of things, right? Who does what in your business? How much do you do? And who else do you have within that business that does things? Because everything that you do, once you leave that business, someone else is going to have to do, right? And so you need to think about those things. Company finances. Do you have too much debt? How's your record keeping, your bookkeeping, right? And my brother is a tax accountant, right? And for small businesses. And he still has clients that'll give him stuff in shoe boxes, right? When it's time to do their taxes at the year at the end of the year. And today's age of QuickBooks and those tools, that's kind of not the best way to do things anymore, right? And so all of those things are going to have to be fixed, right? The state of the economy and market, right? So we saw this during the Great Recession. We saw it during COVID, where if you get this downturn in the general economy, the value of your business is probably going to go down with it, right? And so I've talked to some business owners that through both of those events were like, yeah, I'm going to have to stick it out for another couple years, right? And get it back up and hopefully things turn around. Or I've even had a few say, I'm tired of fighting these battles. I don't care how much my business, the value of my business is down. I'm done fighting these battles, right? So I've seen both of those kind of situations, but that state of the economy and the market has a big impact on what your timeline is as well and what you need to do for your business. And the state of your industries, right? So the semi-humorous kind of example of this is if you were the manufacturer of horses and buggies, right? Buggies for the horse and buggy world, and you saw the Ford Model T come out, right? And you didn't see that happening and start thinking about, okay, so how am I going to transition this horse and buggy business to the 20th century, right? So those kind of examples as well. Where does my business sit in terms of long-term growth, not just for the business, but for the industry that we're in? So you got to think about all of those things. And you got to think about what can be done given current circumstances. So I've worked with business owners where their personal circumstances, one business owner I can recall had a spouse who had significant health problems. And so their timeline for getting out shrunk to like 3 months, right? 2 to 3 months. And so those current circumstances can really impact that, right? And limit what you can do to change things, right? Organization and other constraints. How much? So if you really want to change something that you do, but it requires purchasing a $250,000 piece of equipment. Is that something that you're going to do right now or not, right? Your available resources, again, that kind of fits into that example as well, your industries and your time frame. So all of these things are going to tie into what you can do and how fast you can do it and what your timeline is going to be. So now we get into who can help, right? And I mentioned earlier the folks at SCORE. They're always a great resources, but your resources can come from a wide array of sources, right? They can be inexpensive or extremely expensive, right? Depending on what your plan is, the size of your business, and all of those kind of things. Can consume a significant amount of time. That's one of the big challenges for a lot of business owners. How can I set aside, if I'm integral to the operations of the business, that's probably what I like doing. And so I like to work in the business, but have to realize that now I'm going to have to work on the business, right? And so you have to dedicate the time to do that. And so that takes time away from doing other things, right? And so that can be an issue. It could not be an issue depending on how you've structured your business. And then there's always the DIY or professional. And at some point, you're going to always going to need professionals, right? You're going to need an attorney, probably. You're going to need maybe evaluation person, an appraiser, and a financial planner at some level, right? And others as well, right? A good tax accountant. But you can do a lot of work DIY as well. And so that's kind of what we're doing here a little bit, and kind of maybe some of the support that we can provide you. So as you start thinking about DIY stuff, so we've got the SCORE folks, right? And there's a lot of talented people at SCORE that you can take advantage of. And you have access to their resources. Their resources are free, right? It's crazy not to take advantage of free resources. You can talk to us. We're mostly free, right? So that initial conversation, the stuff I'm doing here today, a copy of the book, that initial conversation to talk about your goals and objectives, all that stuff is free for you. And we can make referrals to folks that you're probably going to have to pay for, right, at some point. But you can do a lot of that kind of initial work, cobbling together these resources, the small business development centers that Ed mentioned earlier. All of these folks can help you with work, with getting some of this stuff done. Oops, I thought I had a slide here, but you have the internet or public library, right? So depending on the size of your business, uh, especially the public libraries and the internet and their resources through the public library, though their internet resources through the library can provide you a lot of really good information, right? Worksheets, access to market reports for your industry to kind of think about where your business is going to want to go, even without the succession planning piece, right? There's these databases out there that you can access, usually for free through public libraries. You can, if you're in the Kent area and you are, I forget what the requirements are, but I think for the general public, you can go to the Kent Library and get access to the Kent Library as a community member, right? And Kent Library has access to a lot of these major quality, high level databases and other resources to get you market reports, that can get you financial reports, all sorts of things, right? Industry data and all of those kind of things. Business schools, I know that the Kent State School of Business has an entrepreneurship program. So if you're just starting a business, there's resources like us that come out of universities. There's other nonprofits out there that are doing this kind of work, small business development centers and others. That's one of the services that we can provide. And I'm sure Ed and the folks at SCORE can do that as well. Even if we can't help you with a specific thing internally, maybe we can connect you with the right resource to get the help for, that you need to kind of do that DIY part of this process, right?
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
Actually, the Stark County libraries, especially the one downtown, the main library, they offer kind of the same thing that the Kent library system does.
Right.
We have access to quite a number of databases to help you, even if you're a nonprofit, what grants are out there and what have you. So I would, if you're in Stark County, check out the Stark County libraries. So.
Yeah, and Summit does too. So I know the main location in Akron does that same thing, right? And I can't think of any one of them that doesn't do that, right? Any one of the major libraries. You may have to go to a certain branch, or the main branch, the chief branch, right? But yeah, and it's a great resource, and we use them all the time ourselves. I did a feasibility study for a startup grocery store. Community grocery store, and I utilize those resources to, get market reports, to get, kind of thinking about, okay, what kind of revenues I did the pro formas, right? And so we were projecting revenues, and I grabbed all that data. It took a little bit of time, right? But the huge resources.
Tom wanted to remind us about the Cleveland Public Library in
Yep.
Cuyahoga County. That's another great source.
Yeah, all the major libraries, right? So each community is different, right? But Cuyahoga, Summit, Portage, Kent kind of fulfills that function here in Portage County. I know that probably Youngstown State does it, right? Youngstown in there. So all of those major areas are great resources, those libraries. And it may take a phone call, right? Say, okay, I want this. Where do I go? Which one of your branches do I go to? But wonderful resources, all of them.
Hey, Chris, this is Ed again. Hey, I just wanted to let you know I got to jump off. I've got something else coming up here, but Gwen will be helping watch the questions. So, okay.
All right, sounds great.
And I'll touch base with you later today or tomorrow. So,
Okay, sounds
all right.
good.
Thank
All right.
you.
Yep,
Bye.
thank you. So then there's your advisors, right? So typically you need an attorney, a CPA, accountant, banker, investment banker, depending on the size of your business, appraiser, or someone to do that kind of valuation piece, a financial planner for you personally, and any other specialist, and so much of this is determined by you, what your goals and objectives are, the size of your business, the industry that you're in. All of these kind of things impact how how many of these people that you need, right? And how much you need them, and quite frankly, how much you're going to pay them, right? And so typically, if you're a smaller company like the one my dad has, he probably could use an attorney that wasn't, not necessarily part of these large corporate law firms, right? Maybe you don't need that $1,000 an hour attorney, right? Maybe you can use one of the smaller attorneys, or the more affordable, or the CPAs, right? So depending on all of those factors, who and the type of these individuals that you're going to need can differ. And that's another thing, that kind of going through your goals and objectives, that we can help you with, kind of determine, okay, so this is what you're thinking, this is the size of business that you are, these are the kind of category of people that you need to talk to. We can help you narrow it down. I always encourage business owners. I don't know of too many business owners that don't already have some type of professional advice. They usually have an attorney, a CPA, someone at the bank that they're working with, right? Maybe a financial planner already as individuals, right? I always say, go to them first, right? They know your business better than a stranger would, right? And hopefully they'll be able to tell you if they can help you with this, or if you're going to need to find someone else to help you with this, right? But always go to who you have already, and ask them, okay, thinking about succession, how can you help me, right? And so go there first, but we can also help with kind of thinking about, okay, do I need a broker, or do I need an M&A specialist, right? Typically brokers are smaller companies, M&As are large. It's basically the same function for you, but typically the M&A folks are for the larger companies. We can help, kind of narrow that down, and help you with finding the right people, not just the right people to do the work, but the right sized people, in a sense, if that makes sense, right? Both in terms of cost and scope and all of those kind of things to help you get done what you need to get done. And then you have the plan, implementation, and execution, right? So we like to take steps. I find that, handling this, having to handle this all at, within a short time frame. That's another thing, that short time frames can impact is how much time do you have? Can you bite off manageable chunks and do this over time, do it in a relaxed fashion, and get everything you need to done over a period of time? Or are you in a hurry, right? But if you have the time, start on manageable 90-day goals, right? Don't try to do everything all at once. Think about your goals and objectives. Okay, think about getting evaluation done then, and thinking about my options. We're going to talk about options here in a minute, right? But I find managing things in bite-sized chunks can be very useful. I always think of that Christmas special, put one foot in front of the other, right? And soon you'll be walking out the door, but it's each step will get you there, right? You don't, you can't necessarily bridge that gap in one lunge, right? You got to take the steps to get there. You always want to review your progress and adjust. Don't be afraid to adjust, right? It can be frustrating, right? To have to adjust, but it happens all the time. It happens almost every time, right? Find few business owners that haven't had to adjust what they're doing throughout this process. Only proceed to the next goals when appropriate, right? Don't try to short circuit the process or the time that you have. And knowing where you are going, like that's again the importance of those goals and objectives. Knowing where the end goal is will really help you inform everything that you do to get there, right? So sometimes business owners want to start this process without knowing where they're going. And that can cause problems because then you can get just pushed out in a bunch of different directions and not stay focused. So where to next? It looks like I'm going to have about another 25 minutes worth of presentation, and then we'll have about 5-10 minutes at the end for any additional questions that come through. But where to next? So the next step is to think about options, right? And so this is when it can get a little kind of, uh, uh, it's not uncommon for things to start kind of expanding out into too big of a kind of area that you kind of get lost sometimes, right? So there's literally almost a limitless number of technical ways that you can transfer an asset from one person or entity to another person or entity. Literally there's trust, there's gifting, there's selling, there's all different types of ways to sell a business. The options are almost limitless, but that's not necessarily an ideal way to think about it. But so we always try to, again, dial back, take the big view and say, yeah, but really there's only two, right? There's only really two options when you want to transfer a business. Whoops. Inside or outside, right? And so within each of those categories, those large categories, there's sub options, right? That's when they can get a little complicated. But I always try to ask business owners, what are you thinking? You thinking an inside sale or an outside sale? Okay, so what do those terms mean, right? So typically in an inside sale, what we're talking about partners. So if you have a partner, maybe they're the option for you to transition your ownership stake to. Maybe it's children, maybe it's some employees, right? A key person buyout, management buyout, or it's all employees. So that's kind of where the all employees is where the employee ownership piece in. There's some strategies within those all employee options, right? So basically this is kind of the four major kind of subgroups of that inside option, right? So when we talk about partners, one of the great things about partners is that as long as you're getting along, right? You've got business continuity, right? And that can be important. Like I said, sometimes it might take you a year or 2 or 3 or 4, or even longer to get all of your money out, right, of the business. So ensuring that business continuity is important. And maybe it's an important thing for you, emotionally and mentally as well, kind of your legacy thinking, right? You want to see this business continue. They hopefully probably understand the business, right? I've seen some situations where it doesn't seem that they do, but typically if you've got 2 or more people working in a business, they both understand the business. Maybe each of us have our own specialties, but they probably understand the business. They probably want the business. But you also have to think about their timeline, right? So if I worked with a business recently where one of the owners is 62 and the other one's 54, right? So that's a pretty good mix, right? So the challenge becomes, right, if you're both 62, right, and you're both thinking about retirement or getting out of the business at some point, and as you get older too, there's greater risk of health issues intervening, for example. So you got to think about their timeline, right? If you're kind of only kicking the can down the road another 6 months, right? Maybe that a partner option isn't the best option, right? Maybe you both need to be thinking about succession instead of just one of you. Typically, conflicts come about, about the price and whose work, which partner contributed most to the current value of the business, right? That's typically where the conflicts can arise. And so, one of the options that you have here is what they call buy-sell agreement. So before, maybe 10 years before, 5, 10 years before thinking about this, you create a buy-sell agreement that kind of lays out the terms for one partner buying out the other partner. So you kind of set that up when you're still getting along, so that if when the time comes to do it and you're maybe no longer getting along as well, the rules, a fair set of rules for both parties have been put in place to kind of help ease that transition. But that's typically where the conflicts typically arises, the price. Children, right? Probable business continuity ensures legacy, right? That's important, keeps it in the family. Probably have some ambition to do it, maybe. Sometimes they don't. Do they have the desire to do it? So, 50 years ago, you would have seen a lot of businesses transition to the next generation of family. It's becoming a lot less common nowadays, a lot less common, right? And it's kind of understandable when you think about it. About one of the first companies I ever worked with was a while ago. It was a small machine shop, and the business owner was, it was a machine shop. It was what it was, right? Machine shops aren't necessarily pristine office environments and those kind of things. And I was talking to the gentleman and his wife. They were both owners, and they had a son who was a doctor. And he was kind of frustrated that the doctor, this son was a doctor, and he was currently practicing in Hawaii, right? And so he was in a lucrative field, financially for himself. It was a career that he chose, right? The business owner was successful enough that they could send their son to school and they could pick out what they wanted to do. And he was living in Hawaii, right? And the business owner was a little frustrated that this son didn't want to come back to Cleveland and run a machine shop, right? And I get it, right? It's an emotional thing. It's a family thing, and so it's not a criticism of that business owner. I do understand it completely, but you got to be realistic as well. So do they have the desire? When I was going to college, I worked in a family restaurant, and the restaurant was owned by a husband and wife, and they had a son that was in the business and kind of running the business for them, and was the succession plan, but really didn't like the family business. He came into the family business as a favor to mom and dad because he felt obligated to do it, right? And the minute the mom and dad retired, that business lasted only 2 or 3 years, right? Because his heart wasn't in it. This wasn't what he wanted to do. He went to school. He went to college here at Kent, and he had a completely different perception in his mind of what he wanted to do with his life, right? And so he wasn't going to be successful because he didn't have the passion for it, right? He didn't have the desire. The other thing is, do they really have the skills, right? So I'm a father. I've got one son who's 20 years old, and I'm going to tell you that my son is the best. He's the smartest. He's the best looking. He's really, really nice. He's a wonderful kid. And any of your kids aren't good enough, aren't as good as my son, right? Well, clearly that's an overstatement, right? But it's common kind of thinking is that we think our children are perhaps more capable in certain areas than they really are, right? So do they really have the skills to run the business? That's a tough question to ask, right? Our kind of evolutionary kind of impetus is to have children take over the business, right? It's kind of innate. It's something kind of in our systems, right? But the question is, you have to be clear-eyed. Do they have the desire, and do they really have the skills to do it? That can be a problem, you know? And by the way, I don't think that about your children. You know, that was just for you know, a point. So we have some employees, so key management people. So there's business continuity, right? So hopefully they know what they're doing. They're managers at your business because they're competent people, right? They probably understand the business. Again, hopefully that's why you've kept them working in the business. They probably have some, you know, ambition. I meet very few higher level management people that don't have some ambition of one day being a business owner, of owning the place, right? The question is, the next 2 points, may not want to put skin in the game. Maybe they can't. Maybe they don't have the resources. So this access to capital to buy the business is a challenge, can be a challenge for them, right? Or maybe the fact of leveraging their house, right, to take out a loan to buy the business is a challenge for them, right? So there's ways to get around that, right? So access to capital, there's ways to get around that. You can finance the transfer through the cash flow of the business over time. What that means is you're probably going to be working a little bit longer than maybe you want to. It's going to be a little slower path for you to get all of the money out of the business. You know, those can be some challenges there, but it's possible to kind of structure it so that the individual key people don't have to actually come up with the cash themselves, or all of the cash, maybe only some of the cash instead of all of the cash. So there's ways to get around that, but these are usually the typical challenges. Then you have all of the employees, right? So we're talking about really employee ownership here. It's a good way to ensure business continuity and legacy. It allows the seller. So if you don't have children wanting to take over the business, if you don't have key people wanting to take over the business, if you don't have an outside buyer to take over to buy the business from you, the options in employee ownership basically allow the seller to create the buyer of the business. Again, it's typically financed through the cash flow of the business over time. So that can lengthen your window of getting all of your cash out, or even your window of transitioning out from a working standpoint from the business, right? So some of the options provide tax breaks. So there's what we call this 1042 rollover with some of the options that allows you to shelter the capital gains from the sale of a business, to defer or otherwise get rid of the capital gains tax on the creation of the business, and you know, the difference in value between when you created the business and when you sell the business. So I'm not going to dig too deeply in that, but I could pontificate on that for at least a half hour. So happy to talk with you about those tax breaks as well. A lot of business owners like this model because it rewards those who help build the business. Very rarely do I see a small business owner that doesn't acknowledge on some level what the employees have brought to the table, so to speak, right? And helping them build this business. It's probably going to require some seller financing, which means you're going to personally finance a portion of the sale of the business. So that means it's going to take a little bit longer for you to get all of your money out of the business, right? But you know, again, if it achieves your other goals, maybe that's something that you can handle, right? Can extend your time in the business as well, right? Because you're going to have to kind of manage that process. It's not going to be a one day I'm the owner, the next day I've signed the paperwork and I'm done. I'm on a beach somewhere in Aruba, right? So those are all, so there's, you know, all of these options have positives and negatives, but those are some of those for the employee ownership option. So then you have the outside sales. So we typically kind of divide these into third-party strategic and third-party financial, okay? And strategic is what it sounds like, right? You get maybe a competitor, a supplier, or a customer wanting to buy your business to kind of vertically, horizontally kind of change the setup of their business, right? And the financial is someone who's making a financial investment. That could be private equity if you're a larger business. It could be a lone individual investor that is interested in buying a business, right? Came into some cash for some reason, wants to buy a business, right? So the third-party strategic, one of the things about third-party strategic is it's likely going to provide the highest price for the business, right? clearly you have something that they want strategically, right? And so typically people tend to pay more for that, right? And it may allow for the quickest exit. 30 years ago, the typical third-party strategic was buying the business, sign the paperwork. We don't need you anymore. Have fun with your money and the rest of your life. Nowadays, it's not that clean anymore. Typically, there might be some components of a look back, right? If you do the deal and you fundamentally, an example of this is if you sell a business and 2 years down the line, the buyer finds out that you didn't tell them about the toxic waste you buried in the back of the building, right? And now they got to clean it up, that they got to shut the business, something bad happens. There's typically things in those sale agreements that allow them to come back and either take some of the money back or even cancel a deal, or all sorts of things can happen through that, right? So typically there's what we call some clawbacks or lookbacks or those kind of things. But typically it's still probably going to be one of the quickest exits, right? Depends on what the other company, what the buyer is bringing to the table in terms of abilities, administrative capabilities and all of those kind of things. One of the things about a third-party strategic is they're probably going to change the business quite a bit, right? So it's not uncommon for a third-party strategic to come in, buy business for the customer list or key patents, intellectual property, a geographic market segment, right? But they don't really need your people. They don't, they're going to change the name out on the front. So they might lay off some people, change the name, and move the business. It's possible, right? So just be prepared. Some business owners have sold, I've talked to some that have sold to a third-party strategic, and they're shocked at what happens to the business, and they feel, kind of emotionally unprepared for the impact of that, right? First offer isn't always final offer, right? A lot of bargaining, a lot of negotiating, and they're going to try to bargain you down and you're going to try to bargain them up. And so there's a lot of work in kind of staking out your positions there, a lot of due diligence that's going to need to be done. And it's generally less likely. I think the latest data that I've seen, somewhere around 30% of businesses that go on the market actually end up selling. Okay, so that's 70% that don't, right? And it's kind of understandable, right? If you're a buyer, you kind of can go out and pick and choose which ones you want to bid on, right? So that kind of makes sense. Another outside is the third-party financial. So that's what we mean is someone buying a business to make a financial investment to get a rate of return. They've got some money, they want to invest it in a business, and they want to get a rate of return. Right. So likely provide more business continuity, because in order for them to get their business investment, their financial investment back, they're not going to necessarily destroy the business. Now, if you're a bigger business and private equity comes in and buys you, they're going to look to typically lever up that company with debt and take a lot of the value out of the business, and in 5-7 years turn around and sell it. So they might provide you a higher price than maybe some of the inside options. They usually don't pay you as much as maybe a strategic buyer would, but sometimes they do, right? May require additional time or years in the business, right? So they may kind of put golden handcuffs on you. And again, all of this depends on the size of the business, right? And they can be hard to find, especially if you're a smaller business. If you're a business with less than 20 employees, maybe a million, $500,000, $1.5 million of sales, whatever it might be. Financial buyers, are going to be hard to find for you, right? Typically, or harder. Not necessarily impossible, but it's going to be a little bit harder. But those are things you got to think about. Okay, so I'm almost done. Got a few more quick things here, and these are kind of just broad kind of things that over the years I've kind of written down to remind business owners all the time about as they go through this process. I always say stay focused on your goals and objectives. If you've got a clear sense of what your goals and objectives are, there's a lot of flexibility in how you get there, right? But you kind of need to get that endpoint, at least a rough sense of that endpoint of what your goals and objectives are. And it'll help keep you focused, right? It'll help keep you on track. When you start getting technical, when things start getting technical, you can just say, stop. How does, and ask of your advisors, okay, I see what you're saying. Not sure I quite understand it. How does this fulfill my goals and objectives? Explain that to me. I think it just helps the business owner stay focused. Stay in charge of what's happening. You know, we have a very human tendency to defer to experts. When I go to a doctor, right, you tend to defer, right? If you've got this thing, pain in my shoulder, right, or something, got a stomach ache or whatever, you know, you go to the right doctor, you're going to kind of defer to their expertise, and it makes sense why, right? I am not a doctor. I don't pretend to play one on TV kind of thing, right? So we tended to defer, and that's understandable. But I see often that I encourage business owners to push back. And any business owner that I talk to, I tell them, you should push back to me. If you don't understand, you don't agree, you don't think this is the right thing to do, feel free to push back. Be nice, right? We always want to be nice in everything that we do, but stay in charge. Make sure you understand why something is happening, and, you know, kind of go back to the previous and how this fits with my goals and objectives. But stay in charge of what is happening, so you're not being led somewhere down a path that you don't want to go to. You wake up 3 months later and it's like, no, this isn't what I wanted. You know, so you got to kind of stay in charge and focus on your goals and objectives. The path may not always be straight, you know. We are human. We're all feel this way. We wish things were simple and easy, right? And something this monumental, right, and this important, and this potentially complex, there's going to be a little bit of zigzagging, right? So again, it's the benefit of time, and also kind of opportunities and options. You're going to be zigzagging a little bit, right? Every business owner that I've ever talked to and gone through a process with, it's not been a straight line, right? It's been, you know, it's kind of like if you have a straight line, you're kind of zigging around it, right? But you're still getting to where the end of the road is. You know what I mean? If that makes any sense. I don't know if you can see my fingers moving around, right? More time, again, more time equals more flexibility. I can't stress this enough, right? If anyone feels that they've waited too long to do this, don't feel guilty, right? The best time to start is now. And so you're here today with us talking about these things. So you've started. So the best time to start is now. But again, remember, the sooner that you can start thinking about these things and planning for these things, the better off you're going to be. And it's just like planning for retirement, right? If I only start contributing to my 401k when I'm 58 or 62, I'm not gonna take full advantage of the 401k structure, right? And I think it's very much the same here. And again, it's kind of staying focused on this very important thing. You know, this is something that you've dedicated a big chunk of your life to, and you don't want to kind of shortchange it, you know. So start as early as you can. And, you know, this is the big thing, the small business paradox. I talk to business owners about this all the time. And my dad was the same way. We have a built-in kind of distrust of the idea of an absentee owner. That's right, especially with a small business, right? The reason we started this business is because this is what I wanted to do. And it makes me feel good. I like doing this thing. I like being important with this thing. And that's all great stuff when you're in that startup phase, right? But as you go through the business, the small business paradox is the less important you are to the business, the more the business is likely worth. Because again, think about it, right? If you run a small business and you're transitioning yourself out of it, and the business can't run without you, how much would someone else pay for that, right? How much, you know, it makes sense, right? And so what I try to encourage business owners to think about, and this ties into management succession, right? kind of finding other people to do some of the things that you do in the business. I run a small center here at Kent State, right? I'm 57. I'm starting to think that way myself. How do I take things off of me? So I'm thinking I've got another 7 years or so, maybe a little longer, maybe, I don't know, 7, 8 years, right? Probably 8 years. I can't do math, right? But probably got eight years, right? And so I got to start thinking about, okay, how do I become less important? What happens when I leave, right? Is the place going to fall apart? And so clearly that makes sense, right? And so if everything is dependent on you, and you're gone, the value of what's left over is a lot less, right? So it's a little hard and it's understandable, right? Very human. And these are not criticisms, right? We all are subject to this, this is part of who we are, of what we do, of how we envision ourselves, right? But the reality is the more important you are to that, the less the business is likely worth. So you got to think about that. All right, so I'm 3 minutes in advance of time, but that's the end of the presentation. A couple things. This is the book that I mentioned at the onset, the Business Succession Planning Book and Owner's Manual. I talked to Gwen and Ed this morning. They're going to send that out and post it. Feel free to share it with whomever. Again, there's the worksheets in the back of that. It's a relatively short book. It's meant for business owners, busy business owners, right? It's an overview of the process. It's not necessarily, the worksheets aren't necessarily going to provide you a full template, right? But they're going to get you they're going to save you some costs in legal fees and paying someone to help you go through some of this stuff. But hopefully it'll give you a pretty good framework for which to develop your plan. And happy to put that out there. My contact info is there as well. You reach out to us at any time. We're happy to talk to any business owner. We can make referrals to professionals that can help you. We've got a pretty wide network of those folks. We've got a pretty wide network of other nonprofits. Talk to Ed and the folks at SCORE, right? For anything that you need. It's an amazing organization. Reach out to them. The last thing I want to say is that we're very fortunate to have the support of both the Cleveland Foundation and the Burton D. Morgan Foundation here in Northeast Ohio to fund this work that we're doing and allow us to come out to you, provide these materials and provide this time, provide the consultation time with you to talk with you on the phone or on a Zoom call, one-on-one, and kind of help you work through some of these things. So that's all I have, Gwen. I don't know if any other questions came through.
We have a question from Leslie, who is just starting her business.
Mm-hmm.
And she's asking questions about succession planning, at the start.
I think that's, I once did a business succession planning presentation to a group of startup entrepreneurs at a small business development center, event. So they had this course of classes that these startup entrepreneurs, and I had 3 or 4 people ask me why I haven't even really started. I'm just getting started. Why do I need to think about succession? And I think that's a fair point, right? What I would say to you is that clearly, right, at startup, you have a lot of work to do. It's going to take a lot of time and effort to get this business started and going, right? But don't wait too long to think about, okay, what's my vision, right, for this business? What's my vision for myself, right? Maybe a year or 2 or 5, I don't know how long it is, right? For each business, it's different. For each business owner, it's different. But start thinking about this from a strategic standpoint. Okay. And it's going to help you think about how to grow the business, right? How to build the business, right? If you have this sense of what your end vision is, right? And it clearly, like I said, I think I mentioned earlier that things are going to change, right? When you're at this early stage, and a lot of things are going to change in a lot of ways, right? And so your vision is probably going to change somewhat, right? But again, that kind of that endpoint, that lodestar, right, that's out there, kind of helps you think about building the business, the way you want to build the business, the stuff that you want to do within the business, and how I'm going to finally exit that, you know. So I encourage, I'm really glad you're starting a business, right? And I realize the kind of inherent kind of like what, you know, kind of approach to thinking about succession at this early stage. But again, I firmly believe that that exit plan is part of your strategic plan. And again, things will change, but just keep on thinking about it, you know. Don't let it catch up to you after 35, 40 years working in the business, like, oh, I didn't do anything about that, you know, or think about that at all. I don't know. Does that make sense, Gwen?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
And Tom wants to know if the booklet that we'll be sending out, the owner's manual, does that provide a detailed template about how to describe the business?
Mm, so it asks you, I think the first worksheet, I want to say it asks you to describe the business. Right. So none of the worksheets are essentially deep dives. You know, it's like eight or 10 of them, and they're kind of the first step to thinking about each of these things. So we kept them short. So we at one point in time we developed a questionnaire for a business owner that was like 15 pages long of a lot of questions, right? And we realized that that's a lot of work. So yes and no. I don't know if I wouldn't classify it a deep dive or a detailed kind of thing. You can use the worksheet to kind of help you develop that deep dive, right? And start you thinking about it, and you can expand on it to the extent that you wish. I don't know. Does that make sense? I mean, we tried to keep them kind of the way to start thinking about each of these things. So each of the components, each of the worksheets kind of capture a specific type of component of the process. And they
Gwen,
can all be expanded. You know what I mean?
Gwen,
Yes.
I have a little bit more specific question. I'm unmuted? Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely. Anybody who
Okay,
has questions.
so Chris, in the business that my business partner and I created 10 years ago, we knew we would need a whole library of templates that we could use with our customers. And one advisor that we have has said that in this prospectus that we're putting together for our business, we're sharing too much. What I mean, we have a template for a strategic plan, a template for a technology plan. It's dealing with organizational accreditation that's being required by the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services.
Okay.
So, one advisor said that if we list all of these templates or provide examples of them in our perspectives, then we're giving away our intellectual property too easily. So my question was more not about the templates that are in your booklet, which I'm anxiously looking forward to reviewing, but how much is too much and what shouldn't you share is more what my question is.
Yeah, so I've got a couple thoughts on that. So I don't know the industry that you're in as well as you do, clearly. I'm not as familiar as you are with what potential buyers would pay to know, right? In a sense. So it's hard for me to kind of judge specifics, but I think your advisor is right, generally speaking, right? I think you really want to be careful. So you want to think about so you're creating this to sell the business as a prospectus to a potential buyer.
Yes, we are creating a prospectus that we think. I mean, it's got our financial information in it. It's got our biographies. It's got our history of how we came to develop the concept, and it gives an outline of what the processes are. And we have included in it a list of every template that we would use for each phase of it. And the advice we got so far was shorten that and limit the amount of information you share in this. And if somebody becomes more potentially serious about the purchase, then we can begin to share that information.
Yeah, that's, yeah, again, not an attorney, right? But
Right.
that's a very sound advice. It sounds to me like you're providing way too much information,
Okay.
for sure. I think prospectus is, so I think we should look at this as differently. So I know that you can get a prospectus for an investment fund that they're trying to encourage you to invest in, right?
Right.
I think we want to, so they're going to provide you with a lot of information, a lot of historical financial information of how your investments have done, about the organization. I think you want to kind of throw that kind of thing to the side a little bit and look at your type of what you're trying to do here is more like a PR. So think about it almost as an expanded press release or
Okay.
a brochure about your business. I think is the best way that I could describe it, and kind of sell yourself, right? The quality of your work, satisfaction surveys, broad really broad information about how well you've done financially, or not even that, but how the business has grown, the number of clients. That think about it as a public relations exercise, right?
Gotcha.
You
Okay.
entice people, and then you get them to come in, and they got to sign some kind of a confidentiality agreement or letter of intent. And that's when you can start sharing stuff. But even then, you kind of want to lock them down to specific legal stuff before you share anything. So again, I'm not an attorney. And I don't know what kind of attorney that you have or who the advisor was. I think you need to be real careful, and I think you should talk to an attorney, someone who, or even a good business broker who as their line of work helps companies sell themselves to other companies, to other
I
buyers.
did, um, I did speak to a business valuation person with my partner's approval, and they gave us a range of what they thought we could sell our business for, and we have a couple of people prospects that we're trying to gear up a presentation for, but I just felt uncomfortable with giving a list of every little tool that we had that we used. It's in the mental health and substance abuse disorder area based on some legislation that has come down from the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services requiring third-party accreditation. That's what our business is. We help people get ready for the certification.
Yeah, but I think you really want to kind of talk to a legal an attorney that can help you determine how much you share and when,
Okay.
and be
Thank you
very
for your
careful.
time. Very much
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Sure,
Okay.
and again, I think you want to be real careful what you start sharing without some kind of agreement that they're serious about actually buying you, because
Okay.
they'd be happy to not pay you anything
Right.
and get all your secrets. That would be a gold mine for them,
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. I know, Gwen, that we're kind of out of time. I'm happy to stick around if there's additional questions. I will stay until every question is answered.
And you should feel free to unmute and ask your question if you so desire. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, I can't see the chat or the questions, but I want to thank everyone for coming out. And thanks, Gwen, to you and Ed for giving me this opportunity to talk and be a part of what you guys are doing. This is fantastic.
No, it's our pleasure. Thank you. Okay. So doesn't look like there are any more questions, so we can go on and in this webinar, but I mean, just want to thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. What a lot of great information.
Yeah, hopefully it's not too much. The biggest part for me is figuring out what I leave out in a presentation, right?
I don't think there's much.
Okay.
Okay.
Hopefully that's meant in the best possible way.
Absolutely. And, oh yeah, that could have been taken, but no. But so thank you so much for everybody who attended. And if you could see the chat, and you could see there are a lot of thank yous. Thanks for the advice. Thanks for the good training. It was very helpful. That's the feedback.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. This is what we love to do. This is my life's work in a sense, you know. So you can tell I don't have any problem talking about it.
Right. Right. Yes. And you can always tell when somebody has a passion for what they're doing.
Right, right.
Okay. So, well, we'll check with you later, and everybody will receive a copy of the handouts and a link to the recording. So, okay, Chris.
All right, thanks everybody. Take care.